Hello, I'm Wendy. Today we're going to start to paint buildings. It's a cottage row and it's part 2 in my Start to Paint Buildings series. In part 1 I painted this simple little cottage row that you can see here. I talked about some very basic watercolour techniques that you would need to build up a picture like this. I'll put the link in the description box below if you feel you'd like to have a look at that. Today I'll be demonstrating a painting very similar to this one. I'll use the same techniques I used in the previous video, but with more landscape details, including the background trees, a slate fence and gate, and a more detailed foreground. Here's the drawing of the cottages that I used. If you'd like a link to the template, you'll find it in the description box below. You can see here that I've done some masking out. I've masked out the roofs and the side of the building. I didn't feel it was necessary in this case to mask out the whole of the cottages, but it will be a help when I put the sky on behind, as you'll see. I've also got some paints ready, and I'm using, for the sky, as I did in the previous video, I am using indigo. In this case I've mixed indigo with some ultramarine. The image size I'm working on here is about 7 by 5, by the way. What I'm putting on here now is a mix of the ultramarine with just a touch of indigo. If you'd like a bluer sky, then miss out the indigo and put your first coat on with just ultramarine. It's a very loose wash, just going on with dips so that you can see the brush strokes. It's going to be a sky after all, it's not got to be too neat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this first wash on and then drop some of a darker mix into it, as you'll see. You can see why the masking fluid can be a help here. It means you don't have to very carefully paint around, the chimneys and little details. The use of angled or sort of vertical brush marks like this, I think, can help with aerial perspective. It makes the sky appear to be behind the cottages, I think, rather than actually being painted around them. And in this case, again, it helps to have the buildings masked out or to have the roofs masked out. When the sky was absolutely dry, then I rubbed off the masking fluid, and what I'm doing now is I'm painting the roofs. I'm giving them a first coat, and it's a mixture of raw sienna with maybe a touch of burnt umber in it. And as I said, this is a first coat, so I'm going along and putting this on each of the 3 roofs. I'm also putting some of this colour into the foreground and also adding a little bit of burnt sienna to it. I don't like to work in an area and leave the rest of the picture as white paper, if you like. I do like to work around the picture and to keep some of that white area covered. I find it much better to judge tones like that and to judge colours rather than having big expanses of white paper. You can also see I'm adding a touch of green into here as well. I think you'll also find that areas like foregrounds are not as intimidating if you've actually got some colour down. So I would suggest doing this definitely. And this picture I'm painting here was taken from a little cottage row that I see in Pembrokeshire quite often, in southwest Wales where I live. And very often you see these trees are growing around houses and on the roads that are windswept. They've grown in the direction of the prevailing wind. You see them very often, and what I'm doing here now is I'm painting these windswept trees behind the cottage at the left-hand side here, taking some care with edges so that the edges of the cottage are nice and sharp. The colours I'm using will be burnt umber with one of the blues. You could use the indigo. That might make it a little bit more on the green side. If you want to keep it brown, then use the burnt umber and darken it a little bit with the ultramarine. So I'm taking a bit of care here. along the rooftops. And you can also see on the left hand side that I've done a little bit of negative painting, painting these windswept trees at the base of them around the fence posts there on the left hand side of the cottages. For the tree on the right hand side, I'm using more of a dry brush stroke on that, so it's a different sort of tree there. It's also probably a little bit further back as well. Again, painting around the roof quite carefully. I'm using some slightly darker paint towards the base of the tree and then carefully painting around some of the slate fences there. Again, if they weren't there in any detail, you could do some negative painting to bring them out. The next stage was to finish off painting the traditional Pembrokeshire cottage roofs, and for this I used a slightly darker mix than I did for the first coat, adding some burnt umber. I didn't want the lines on the roof to look too regular, so I painted each roof in a similar way, and I just softened some of the edges of the downward strokes. I painted the windows in a similar manner to in my previous video. I just painted a sort of little triangle in one of the corners, presuming the light here was coming from the left or towards the front of the cottages. And underneath the eaves in this case, I painted a very, very thin line, very, very thin dark line that was broken. Again, I didn't want it to look too solid. The colours I'm using for this would be the burnt umber mixed with some of the ultramarine. For the doors, I put lines along the top and along the left hand side, as you can see. When they were dry, then I painted the colours of the door in, which I made a sort of orangey colour. Some cadmium orange with a touch of the burnt sienna. At this stage I went back to work on the foreground, and I've got some colours mixed here. They're varying greens, which would be the blue that you used, probably the ultramarine, with some cadmium yellow and some raw sienna. So you've got one or two colours here that you can drop wet into the foreground. I actually wetted the foreground in different places, and then I dropped this colour in, as you can see. It's quite difficult to describe how I do it actually, because I do it quite intuitively. I'm never quite sure what I'm going to get at the end of it. But some areas will be wet, so the colour will go in wet into wet. The drier areas, you'll get more of a dry brush effect. So you'll get all these different brush strokes going on, and it might look a bit odd at the moment, but it dries nicely. It dries as if there's quite a lot of texture in the foreground. It keeps a nice loose foreground, and it's quite easy to do. You might find you need a little bit of practice with it. Try and alter the tones as well as you're working, so you've got some areas that are lighter, and then you'll see that I'm dropping some darker colour in as well. This makes all the difference. It gives the foreground a bit more form than if it was all one tone. To make the greens darker, add a bit of your burnt umber with a bit more blue possibly, and you can see I'm also dropping in some of the orange. I'm using a very watery mix of the ultramarine with a touch of the indigo in there. to paint some very translucent shadows underneath the eaves. This particular one here was a touch dark, so you'll see I pulled some of the colour out of that. You must paint these shadows very transparently and try and put just one layer of colour on. Otherwise it looks as if there's actually been some dark colour painted on the walls of the cottages themselves. Using a similar mix, I painted the shadow side of the chimneys. And next I painted some shadow sides on the slate fencing. Because in this picture I was leaving the slate fencing a very light tone, almost white paper, I did have to find a way of making them stand out, of making them separate and in front of the cottage. So in places what I did was I painted some grass behind them. Some of the little bits of grass you can see I did paint in front of one or two of them, but I hope you can see that by painting some of these grasses behind them, it was another sort of way of negative painting, so that by painting the grass behind, then I'm making the slate fences stand out in front of the cottage. This may explain it better. This is a close-up of one of the areas that I was painting. I'm using my rigger brush with a dark mix of the ultramarine and the burnt umber. I added a little bit more dry brush, using the rigger this time, to the foreground. I didn't want to overdo it, so I didn't want to do too much. I put a few little bits of grass in one or two areas. And then I think just a tiny bit of shadow or something around one or two of the shapes to suggest stones. Using the same dark brown mix I painted in the gate, as you can see here. I just used a very fine brush. Now I think was a good time to place an old mount around the picture, just to assess it and see what else I needed to add. I did strengthen the shadow a little on one or two of the slate fences. And also I put a shadow, a sort of triangular shadow similar to the windows, on each of the doors using a very transparent blue mix. And also I put this transparent blue mix over some areas of the foreground as well, to suggest some cast shadows across the ground, add a little bit more interest and colour in the foreground. There may have been a cast shadow formed by the gate as well, and across the path a little bit. It's always nice to indicate, to show some signs of life, I think, when you're doing pictures like this. In this case, I thought I'd put a bit of smoke coming out of the chimney. I'll show you how I do this. I use some opaque white gouache, and as you can see, using a very fine brush, I just paint a little bit of this on, and then where it's sort of dissipating up into the sky, I put a little bit of water beside it, and that can look quite effective. I rubbed all the pencil lines out, and it's surprising what a difference this can make actually to your picture. So all the pencil lines were rubbed out and a nice clean mount put around it. And then I was just wondering if there was anything else that I could do, and I thought there was a little bit of a gap that needed a little bit of work there. This area of the fence and a few grasses going up into the house. It's all very subjective what you do here, isn't it? This is picture making. So you want to look at your picture and just decide if there's anything that you just need to add at the end without being overly fussy. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you found something useful that you could use in your own pictures. If you did and you don't want to miss any future content, then you can always subscribe to my channel. Bye for now.